very pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here, in fact. I'd like to kind of get started right away. If I can be sure that this does what it's supposed to do. The New York Central Railroad spectacular, entirely new Grand Central Terminal opened at midnight on February 2nd, 1913, after 10 years of construction at the railroad's terminus here at 42nd Street. It was and it remains the world's largest train terminal, measured by the number of platforms. There are 44, and tracks, 67. Most of the terminal was underground, 2 levels of electrified tracks under what would become Park Avenue, fanned out from 4 trunk lines at 50th Street into what was and remains the deepest foundation ever excavated in Manhattan. At street level, the terminal building itself was a long, low, elegant structure, a masterpiece of the prevailing Beaux-Arts referenced style of architecture. Its south-facing granite facade stretched 2 full blocks in length, and it's the only building in Manhattan still that sits squarely across an avenue. This is a picture of it in 1914. Travelers entering the main entrance at 42nd Street descended a rather steep slope that opened into a vast waiting room, today's Vanderbilt Hall, an extravagant space 3 stories high, a block long, with a pink marble floor, 5 sculpted marble bays, carved oak benches, palm trees, huge rectangular windows, and 5 immense chandeliers lit with unshielded white light bulbs. From the waiting room, the traveler descended further down an elegant marble sloping bridge over 2 much deeper ramps into a truly breathtaking space, the long distance or express departure hall known today as the main concourse. A vast floor of pink marble measured 275 by 120 feet. At the west side, an elegant marble staircase descended from a marble balcony. In the center, a golden clock with 4 opalescent glass faces rose over a marble information kiosk. At the rear, dozens of marble and brass windows sold tickets, and across the entire north wall, more than 20 sculpted doorways led to ramps that descended without stairways to the waiting long-distance trains, which were entered at the platform level. All of these are innovations. At either end of the hall, 3 arched 75-foot windows simulated an immense triumphal arch, and more than 12 stories overhead, a vast ceiling spanning the entire space, glimmered with the lights of 2,500 stars, 60 of them actually lit, and 10 constellations outlined in gold leaf, whirled across a deep sky, flanked by the celestial equator and the ecliptic, crossing at the vernal equinox. This simple but breathtaking mural, one enormous painting covering 33,000 square feet on a plaster ceiling, was suspended like almost every other element in the main concourse from the terminal's steel skeleton. Most people feel it's stone, but it's actually all steel. Like every other aspect of this grand terminal, the celestial ceiling received the highest praise from critics, architects, engineers, press, and public. Reports spoke of awe and wonder at the astronomical ceiling. It was said to be such an accurate picture of the winter sky over the Mediterranean that science teachers could bring their students there to study it. How had this marvelous celestial ceiling been conceived and executed? Actually, it was almost an accident, a last-minute solution that only came into focus in the last year of the terminal's construction. The great American shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt had assembled the New York Central Railroad in the last decade of his life, and he built the first Grand Central Station at 42nd Street, which was the street New York City had designated as the limit for steam engines to come into Manhattan. In 1902, the New York Central Railroad, pressured by the city, adopted a plan by their brilliant chief engineer, William Wilgus, to electrify the system and build an enormous new terminal on the site with all tracks sunk underground on 2 levels. Construction began in 1903. The first 7 years were occupied entirely by the excavation and the laying of electrified track. Only in 1910 did construction of the terminal building itself begin. Plans for the terminal design had been matters of considerable dispute. William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius, from his position on the board of the New York Central, insisted that the original architects, Reed and Stem of St. Paul, Minnesota, lacked the training to design an appropriately elegant structure. He insisted that the Vanderbilt's personal architect, Whitney Warren, be given the commission and a joint firm established. Whitney Warren was the personification of the Paris-trained American architect. He had spent 10 years training in Paris at the School of Fine Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts. His plans represented a pinnacle of Beaux-Arts design, integrating classical elements of architecture with sculpture, painting, and furnishings in entirely new types of building to masterful effect, such as the New York Yacht Club shown here. While Reed and Stem were chiefly responsible for the ingenious system of ramps connecting the many levels of the terminal and virtually eliminating stairways, Whitney Warren took charge of the facade and the elegant main spaces of the terminal. Working with French sculptors and immigrant Italian craftsmen, he designed the great windows of the facade and the main concourse. And for the ceiling, he designed a huge concave skylight to match the windows and illuminate the space. You can see the skylight right there over the main concourse. But by 1912, material costs and construction delays led the board to cancel the skylight plan and insist on a faster and cheaper alternative, a plaster ceiling suspended from the roof. Warren called on his friend from Paris, the famous society painter Paul Helleu, to decide what to do with the ceiling. Paul Helleu was a well-known post-impressionist painter in Paris. Married into Parisian upper classes, he became famous for his dry-point etchings of beautiful women, beginning with his wife. He accepted his friend's commission to paint the ceiling, and he is credited with the idea and the design for it: the Mediterranean sky in winter. Helleu kept a large yacht in Deauville. He was a skilled yachtsman and navigator, and perhaps that was the inspiration for the ceiling. Helleu chose mankind's most ancient and revered pictures, the constellations. He proposed using a Renaissance sky map as a model to paint the visible constellations in Renaissance figurines, plus more than 2,000 stars painted to match their magnitudes, including a band of the Milky Way crossing the equator and the ecliptic. The brightest stars, 60 of them, were to be illuminated with electrical light bulbs, part of the overall celebration of electrification that characterizes the terminal. For technical assistance, Warren and Helleu turned to a prominent New York astronomer, Harold Jacobi, professor of astronomy at Columbia University's new Morningside Heights campus. Jacobi was just finishing a textbook on astronomy and had been in the news for the past 2 years, urging New Yorkers to, 2 years earlier, urging New Yorkers to view Halley's Comet in 1910, although by a miscalculation, he missed it himself. Jacobi he actually went to bed too early, and he thought it was going to appear by 12:30, and it actually appeared around 2:30 in the morning. Jacobi is said to have provided a Renaissance sky map for the painters to use as their model. The Brooklyn-based mural firm Hewlett Basing, famous for painting scenic murals for Broadway shows and the Metropolitan Opera, were chosen to actually paint the ceiling. It was a stupendous task. Charles Basing, a native Australian, headed the painting team. Working from a circular map, the painter had to transfer a segment of the map to a vast rectangular curved surface. Many attempts were required to mix a perfect shade of blue-green. The one they settled on was said to match the color of Whitney Warren's favorite shirt. Once the color was mixed, 50 workmen on 12-story scaffoldings simultaneously painted the ceiling all at once, so that the color, not turquoise, not cerulean, not azure, would be uniform. Following that, the constellations and the stars were painted in costly gold leaf that gleamed above the terminal floor, and the electric lights were installed. A magnificent work was complete, and just in time. Take a good look. You can see the ceiling there very clearly. Further design elements enhanced the effect of the ceiling. No chandeliers or other objects interfered with its vast expanse. The naked light bulbs that burn so brightly elsewhere in the terminal, there are 4,000 naked white light bulbs, were here recessed below the ceiling so that the entire concourse seems dimmer and more hushed than all the surrounding halls and corridors. Natural light was let in from the towering east and west windows and the 5 high clerestory windows facing south. The effect is cathedral-like. No chairs, benches, or any seating is provided at any place on the floor level. The Great Ceiling Mural, one of the largest paintings ever created, is dominated by the figures of the constellation and the overarching lines of the equator and the ecliptic. The ceiling is so large that viewers must move and reposition themselves on the floor of the terminal in order to see it all. And it does change quite a bit as you move around the floor of the terminal. Crossing diagonally in a row are its 6 figures of the zodiac, which I'm going to show you in close-up from souvenir magnets that they sell at the Transit Museum, which were the best representations of the individuals I could find. But I've juxtaposed them with figures from Bayer's famous 1603 star atlas, the Uranometria, which seems to have been the source for drawing the figures. So we have Aquarius, 1913 on the left and 1603 on the right. Pisces, the fish. Actually, that's Venus and her son Cupid escaping from a monster. And
Ron, could you go back one
Sure.
second?
They changed themselves into fish to escape a monster, which I think. Pisces, Aries the ram, Taurus the bull, Gemini the twins, Castor and Pollux. I noticed this morning, I think their lights are on. And Cancer the crab. Those are the 6 zodiac figures that cross the ceiling. Two magnificent constellations just outside the zodiac balance the composition in its empty quarters. Pegasus and Orion. Finally, just above the ram, there are 2 small constellations, Triangula, a pair of triangles, and Musca Borealis, the northern fly. Other bright stars dot the ceiling in various locations, and the Milky Way forms a faint band crossing the width of the ceiling from close to Orion to the midpoint on the other side. You can see the Milky Way clearly there. While New Yorkers admired their first views of this wondrous celestial ceiling, a commuter, an amateur astronomer from New Rochelle, who would have arrived and departed on the commuter level, reported to the New York Times in April 1913 that the constellations and stars were reversed from their correct positions. Alerted to the error, astronomers, amateur and professional, quickly agreed. The great work was inverted. You don't need to read this, but a flurry of recriminations ensued, especially between Professor Jacobi and Charles Basing. Jacobi had earlier attested to the high degree of astronomical accuracy in the celestial ceiling, but had evidently not monitored the work as it was finished. He accused Basing of having transferred the model to the ceiling the wrong way by looking down at it rather than holding it over his head. Basing was unconcerned and unapologetic. After all, he's Australian. The Vanderbilts themselves issued a statement that the ceiling had been painted from God's perspective, not man's, and it's the way God sees it, period. The science teachers and their students really never showed up, as far as we know. If you start to flip it, this is a horizontal flip, keeping the west on the right, it would be in its correct west-east orientation. Or you do a vertical flip. What happens, unfortunately, is that some constellations remain correct and others are incorrect. So what had actually happened? Various reports describe the ceiling as reversed, backwards, upside down, mirrored, or in God's view. But all these seem to indicate different, or at least complementary types of error. You may have noticed on the juxtaposed slides that with the exception of Orion, Bayer's figures face in the opposite direction from the Helou-Jacobi basing figures, suggesting that the entire ceiling should be flipped horizontally so that the zodiac figures would go from the west side of the concourse to the east, the way they actually do in the night sky. While the stars within some constellations appear correctly as they would from Earth, other constellations are reversed left to right, as it is the overall arrangement of the constellations on the ceiling. For example, Orion is correctly and beautifully rendered, but the adjacent constellations Taurus and Gemini are reversed, both internally and in their relation to Orion, with Taurus near Orion's raised arm, where Gemini should be. But is there another way of looking at the sky? In fact, Renaissance cartographers did map the stars in more than one way, especially when creating star globes. Unlike a globe of the Earth, which appears as it would appear from the sky or from the moon, a celestial globe imagines the viewer to be at the center of the globe looking up at the sky. Thus, the stars and constellations are arranged correctly on the inside of the globe, but appear in reverse on the outside. This is the imaginary God's eye view. But who is the viewer on Earth on a transparent globe of the skies? The actual viewer outside or the imaginary one inside? Globes exist with several varying solutions. This gives you an idea of a celestial globe. Now, this is the gores of a globe when it's being put together, but if you unfold a globe, there are two additional problems. When printed star atlases were produced accurately, beginning with Albrecht Dürer in 1550, the problem arose of transferring the sky globe to a flat rectangular surface. The problem was usually solved by showing the constellations individually, as in Bayer's atlas one can see in successive transpositions of Dürer's hemisphere that there are multiple possibilities, some of which do in fact reverse the constellations. This is Dürer's complete northern hemisphere. Then this is the area of the northern sky in the winter with the Cancer to Aquarius flipped horizontal, and here it is flipped horizontal and vertical. And sometimes the constellations actually do flip into positions more similar to what's on the ceiling of Grand Central. So perhaps the ceiling is best understood as an unintended lesson in the anomalies of stargazing and star mapping. If Orion is reversed on the ceiling of Grand Central, which I don't think he is, he's also reversed in Bayer, by the way. But there's one more surprising feature on the celestial ceiling, which no one seems to have noticed. Those two little constellations above Aries the Ram don't exist in the international official listing of 88 constellations, where Triangulum is one triangle, not two, and Musca, the fly, is in the southern hemisphere, nowhere near Aries. These two constellations appear in this configuration only in the star atlas of Johannes Hevelius, published in 1690. He invented them, but his creations were never accepted. Musca does appear in Bayer's Uranometria, but rather because Bayer was the first one to map a southern hemisphere, and the still official Musca septentrionalis, or Musca, in the southern sky. So it appears that Hevelius' star charts, not Bayer's, were the source for the star map that Jacobi provided. But one more surprise. Hevelius' ram, shown down here at the bottom, Hevelius' ram is not reversed, while Bayer's is. And there's Musca and the two triangles exactly the same, almost the same as they are on the ceiling. In his atlas, Hevelius showed the constellations as they would appear on a globe, back to front by comparison with their appearance in the sky. So the imaginary God's eye view appears to be vindicated, and Professor Jacobi seems, if anything, somewhat confused. This is, by the way, this is Hevelius' Orion. So Hevelius' figures are not the inspiration. They use Bayer's figures, but somehow also the stars as they appear in Hevelius. For the computer arriving today, or for the wealthy traveler departing on the 20th Century Limited, once New York Central's luxury express to Chicago, the technicalities are of no importance compared to the feelings of elation and awe that the ceiling typically inspires. Whether emerging from the tracks below, descending from Vanderbilt Lounge or the Pan Am escalators, or entering through the low arches of the passageways, one has the sensation to utter the relief that Dante expresses in the last two words of the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, le stelle, the stars. For sheer height, expanse, and surprise, the ceiling bears comparison with what is perhaps still the greatest ceiling on Earth, the interior of Hadrian's Pantheon, itself a marvel of astronomical calculation. It compares with other great painted ceilings, perhaps the best known being Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, which, before he painted over it, was once a ceiling of stars. Whitney Warren and Paul Hellieu would certainly have been familiar with the Mappamondo, an extraordinary Renaissance ceiling in the Farnese Palace at Caprarola in northern Italy. They would also probably have been aware of the popular flamboyant illustrations of the sky and constellations by the 19th century French illustrator César Flammarion, perhaps especially the famous Flammarion engraving of a man poking his head through the celestial sphere to see what was on the outside. You see him down here. Perhaps they also knew of the post-impressionist masterpiece by Van Gogh, at the height of his confinement in a mental hospital, The Starry Night, filled with hope and awe and terror. It was already on view in Paris and the Netherlands before coming to New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1941. And perhaps they knew, ironically, Whitman's irreverent poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, going out then after the astronomical lecture to actually look at the stars in perfect silence. The ceiling took its place beside all these works as one of the great and enduring public works of art in this or any century. But time has not been kind to the celestial ceiling. Within 10 years of its creation, leaks in the roof of the terminal had streaked it and caused serious deterioration. Without any plan or funds for preservation, the ceiling grew darker during the 1930s, the stars began to go out, and falling plaster endangered the travelers below. In 1941, the railroad took matters in hand and brusquely mounted wood panels over the painted plaster ceiling of 1913. They hired a team of painters to recreate the mural as it had been, including the gold leaf, but knowledgeable observers said it lacked the finesse and detail of the original. The new ceiling stayed in place, but along with the entire terminal, it grew progressively dirtier and darker until at the terminal's nadir in the 70s and 80s, following on the bankruptcy of the New York Central, it became entirely black with grime. Even the lit stars were barely visible. Perhaps few noticed, since the world of electrification that the terminal heralded had in fact banished the night sky for most New Yorkers. In 1957, a hole was opened in the sky near the constellation Gemini to allow a guy wire to lift up an Atlas rocket on display in the concourse, or a Redstone rocket. The hole was left there, and it can still be seen today, and it has been used subsequently for stunt wires for films made in the concourse. But the expensive, elegant, aggressive restoration by the firm of Beyer, Blinder, and Bell in the 1990s brought the heavens back to the terminal. Using a simple soap and water solution and mounted on a 12-story rolling scaffold, seen here, workers cleaned the vast ceiling night after night until it was fully restored, at least to its 1941 condition. Tests showed that the original celestial ceiling has deteriorated beyond recognition and could not feasibly be restored. But the restored ceiling of 1941, nevertheless, was one of the many astonishing achievements of the restoration. Tests on the ground showed it was entirely the result of tar from cigarettes and nicotine, not from automobile exhaust. The restorers left a small black rectangle by the constellation Cancer, ironically, to show how black the ceiling had been. In 1997, they also installed new fiber optic lights in the 60 illuminated stars, But the system deteriorated quickly and failed to provide enough light. In 2010, the lights were replaced again, this time with LED lights calibrated to indicate distinct levels of magnitude. And so, day and night, the celestial ceiling welcomes, awes, humbles, and exalts the visitor, the traveler, the arrival, the departure, the native New Yorker, and the latest transplant. It's brighter than ever. To paraphrase Whitman, from time to time, in the mystical marble concourse, I wander off by myself and look up in perfect silence at the stars. Thank you.
For Professor Janoff at this time.
I'm just curious, is there any notice as to why they picked the constellations Pegasus and Orion when they had so many to choose from?
No, my own opinion is that it's just sheerly the beauty of the figures, first of all. Orion, because it's one that it's probably the first constellation that everyone can locate. Pegasus, because it's simply a really gorgeous figure, and over in that quadrant, it kind of swirls beautifully. I think it's completely an artistic decision. Yeah. They could have chosen even the head of Medea. There used to be a constellation, Medea's head, but fortunately they didn't choose that because it looks like a Halloween